Clara Whitmore pressed her trembling hands flat against the dining table and looked straight into the eyes of the man she had loved for 2 years. She did not cry, she did not beg. She simply picked up her gloves slowly, deliberately, and said in a voice so quiet the entire room had to hold its breath to hear it. "Then I will leave. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels." Virginia, summer, 1814. The heat that summer was the kind that sat on your chest and refused to move. By mid-July, the fields around Caldwell Estate had turned from deep green to a pale, exhausted gold. The air smelled of draggrass and horse leather, and something else, something Clara Whitmore had learned to recognize in the months she had spent working inside that grand house. Secrets, rich families always had them, but the Caldwells had made theirs into an art form. Clara had come to Caldwell Estate 8 months earlier, in the gray cold of November, carrying nothing but a small leather trunk, her late father's writing desk, and a recommendation letter signed by Reverend Howell of Richmond. She was 26 years old. She was the daughter of a once respected Virginia family that had quietly collapsed under the weight of her father's failed land investments. There was no fortune left, no powerful relatives, no safety net of any kind. What Clara had was her mind. She could read Latin and French. She could calculate figures faster than most men who called themselves accountants. She had kept her own family's books from the age of 15, watching her father's numbers with the careful eye of someone who understood that numbers never lied, even when the people behind them did. Nathaniel Caldwell had hired her as a household rec-keeper, a modest position, slightly unusual for a woman of her background, but not scandalous. Not yet. In the beginning, she had kept to herself. She took her meals in the small sitting room, adjacent to the kitchen. She answered every question politely and offered no opinions that were not asked for. She wore plain gray dresses and pinned her dark hair flat against her head and gave no one any reason to look at her twice. But you can only stay invisible for so long when you are honest in a house built on lies. The first irregularity appeared in March. Clara had been reviewing the quarterly household accounts, a task that required cross-referencing the estate ledger against the receipts submitted by Edmund Fairfax, the estate's manager, and Nathaniel Caldwell's most trusted advisor. Edmund Fairfax had managed Caldwell Estate for 11 years. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with a wide, friendly face and a laugh that filled rooms. Everyone liked Edmund. He remembered names. He remembered birthdays. He always had a kind word for the kitchen staff and a firm, reassuring handshake for business partners. He also, Clara discovered, had been quietly moving money. Not large amounts, nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm. A few $100s redirected here, a payment described vaguely as relief supplies that corresponded to no delivery. A charitable donation recorded in the ledger that matched no receipt. At first, she told herself she was mistaken. She went back through the records again. Then again, she was not mistaken. The money was earmarked for the Soldiers' Relief Fund, a charitable account the Caldwell family maintained for the widows and wounded veterans of the War of 1812. It was one of the things Nathaniel Caldwell was genuinely proud of. He spoke of it publicly. He held dinners in its name. The Richmond Gazette had written a flattering piece about the Caldwell family's contributions to veteran welfare only 6 weeks earlier. And someone had been quietly draining it. Clara sat with the knowledge for 3 days. She told herself she needed to be completely certain. She checked the figures a 4th time, and then a 5th. She pulled records from 2 years prior and compared them. She wrote out a careful documented summary in her neatest handwriting, with every discrepancy numbered and sourced. Then she went looking for Nathaniel Caldwell. She found him in the east courtyard, talking with 2 men she didn't recognize, business associates, by the look of their clothes. He glanced up when she approached, and something in his expression shifted. Not irritation, not exactly, something more careful than that. She had noticed over the months that Nathaniel Caldwell was always careful with her. He was a tall man, 35 years old, with the kind of assured posture that came not from arrogance but from a lifetime of never being questioned. He had dark eyes and a direct way of looking at people that some found intimidating, and Clara found, despite herself, rather honest. He was not cruel. She had watched him long enough to be sure of that. He was fair with his workers in a way that surprised her. He remembered when a stable hand's wife was ill and asked after her. He did not humiliate people for sport, but he was proud. Deeply, structurally proud. The kind of proud that had been built into him so early and so thoroughly that he probably didn't even recognize it as pride. He simply believed that the Caldwell name meant something. That it represented a certain quality of person, a certain standard of conduct. That the family was, in some fundamental way, better. Not better than everyone, just better than the kinds of problems common people had. Miss Whitmore, he dismissed his associates with a small nod. You look as though you have something on your mind. I do, sir, she said. I need to speak with you privately. It concerns the estate accounts. He studied her for a moment. Has there been an error? I believe so, yes. They went inside. She laid out the documents carefully on his desk. She walked him through each discrepancy, slowly and methodically, the way she had rehearsed it in her head. She kept her voice even. She did not speculate beyond what the numbers showed. She presented only facts. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Nathaniel Caldwell sat back in his chair and looked at the papers in front of him for a long moment. You are suggesting, he said finally, that Edmund Fairfax has been stealing from the Soldiers' Fund. I am suggesting that money designated for the Soldiers' Fund has not reached its intended recipients, Clara said carefully, and that the discrepancies in the records appear to have been deliberately obscured. I cannot say with certainty who is responsible, but the pattern is consistent, and it began 3 years ago. Another long silence. Edmund has managed this estate since my father's time, Nathaniel said. I understand that. He is one of the most respected men in this county. I understand that as well, and you are asking me to believe, based on some figures you've found, that he has been deceiving my family for 3 years. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. She recognized the tone. It wasn't anger yet. It was something that came before anger, the careful, measured resistance of a person who did not want to believe what they were hearing and was looking, without quite admitting it, for a reason to dismiss it. I am asking you to have the records independently reviewed, she said. Nothing more. If the figures are wrong, an independent review will show that. Nathaniel looked at her. I will look into it. She thanked him and left. He did not look into it. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Clara watched the household continue its routines. She continued her work. She said nothing. She waited. And in the meantime, she noticed Edmund Fairfax watching her. Not openly. He was too careful for that. But she caught it the way his eyes tracked her when she crossed the main hallway. The small pleasant smile he gave her that never quite reached his eyes. The way he made a point of being friendly and visible and entirely at ease around her, as though he wanted her to see a man with nothing to hide. It made her skin feel cold. One evening, Reverend Howell came to dine at Caldwell Estate, the same Reverend who had written her recommendation. After supper, as the guests moved toward the parlor, Edmund Fairfax appeared at Clara's elbow. Miss Whitmore, he said pleasantly, may I walk with you a moment? She allowed it. You are a very clever young woman, he said as they moved down the corridor. His voice was warm and easy, completely without edge. I have always admired clever women. My own mother was clever. Thank you, Mr. Fairfax. I imagine it must be difficult, he continued, being in a position like yours. No family connections to fall back on, no real security. Everything depending on the goodwill of your employer. Clara said nothing. I only mention it, Edmund said, still pleasant, because I would hate to see a capable young woman lose a good position over well. A misunderstanding. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly. Are you warning me about something, Mr. Fairfax? He smiled. It was a very warm smile. Of course not. I am only saying the Caldwell family values loyalty very highly. and I think you value your position here. That seems like a fine foundation for a good working arrangement." He nodded pleasantly and walked away. Clara stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then she went back to her room and reviewed the documents one more time. She made a second copy. She hid one set in the bottom of her leather trunk beneath her father's writing paper. And she waited. What came next she had not expected. One afternoon in late June, she was called to the main dining hall. The entire Caldwell family was assembled: Nathaniel, his mother Margaret, and his younger brother William. Edmund Fairfax stood slightly to one side, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression grave and sympathetic in equal measure. Clara walked in and immediately understood that something had already been decided before she entered the room. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table. He did not look angry. He looked resolved, she was learning much worse. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "we need to address the matter of the accusations you brought to me several weeks ago." "They weren't accusations," she said quietly. "They were documented discrepancies." "Mr. Fairfax has reviewed the records." Nathaniel's voice was even. "Controlled. He found no irregularities. He believes the figures you questioned were the result of a misunderstanding of the accounting system used on this estate, a system that differs from what you may have been trained in." Clara looked at Edmund Fairfax. Edmund gave her a small, regretful shake of his head as though he felt genuinely sorry for her. "I understand the accounting system," Clara said. "I am sure you believe that," Nathaniel said. "However, I can walk you through every figure," she said. She kept her voice flat and precise, every single one. "I can show you the original receipts against the ledger entries. I can show you the dates. I can show you 3 years of consistent." "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel cut her off, not unkindly but firmly. "I trust Edmund Fairfax. He has served this family with complete integrity for 11 years. I will not dismantle that trust on the basis of a few months' worth of suspicion from someone who is new to this household." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him. She looked at the resolved expression on his face, the expression of a man who had made up his mind and was not going to unmake it. Not today, not in front of his family, not in front of Edmund Fairfax. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he was not going to believe her. Not because the evidence was weak, but because believing her would cost him something he was not prepared to pay. "Edmund has been generous enough," Nathaniel continued, "not to take formal offense at the implications of your inquiry. However, he does feel, and my family agrees, that under the circumstances an apology is appropriate." "An apology, yes." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "For the disruption your claims have caused, for the implication against a man of his standing." Clara did not move for a long moment. She thought about the numbers. She thought about the soldiers' widows in Richmond, who had written letters to the Caldwell estate, asking why the promised relief payments had not arrived. She thought about Edmund Fairfax standing in the corridor, smiling pleasantly, telling her he would hate to see her lose her position. She thought about the man, standing at the head of the table, the man she had spent 8 months quietly, stubbornly, helplessly falling in love with, and the expression on his face, which was not cruel and not indifferent, but simply utterly certain that he was right. "No," she said. Nathaniel's expression shifted just slightly. "I beg your pardon," I said. "No," Clara said. "I will not apologize." Not for telling the truth. The silence in the room changed texture. Margaret Caldwell made a small sound, something between a sharp inhale and an expression of outrage. William looked uncomfortable. Edmund Fairfax's sympathetic expression did not waver, but his eyes went very still. Nathaniel Caldwell looked at Clara for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that was more serious than volume. "You will apologize to this family tonight, or you will leave this house before sunset." She had not meant to love him. She had noticed it happening the way you sometimes notice a season changing, not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of small things that you convince yourself mean nothing until suddenly they mean everything. The way he listened when she spoke, really listened, not the way powerful men usually listen to women, with half their attention already moving toward their response. He had a particular stillness when something genuinely interested him. His head would tilt slightly, and he would stop whatever he was doing entirely, and he would just listen. The way he remembered things. She had mentioned once in passing that her father had loved a particular kind of apple that grew in the western part of Virginia. 2 weeks later, a basket of those apples had appeared outside her sitting room door, with no note, no explanation. She had never asked him about it, but she had known. The way he looked at her, sometimes not with the hungry, assessing look she had learned to recognize and disarm in powerful men, but with something she could only describe as genuine curiosity. As though he found her interesting in a way he hadn't planned on and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. She had told herself it meant nothing. She was the record keeper. He was Nathaniel Caldwell. The entire architecture of the world they both lived in was designed to ensure that such things meant nothing. But she had loved him, quietly, carefully, with the part of herself that she kept most private. And now she stood in his dining hall, with his mother's outrage prickling the air, and Edmund Fairfax's careful eyes watching her, and Nathaniel's voice in her ears saying, "Apologize, or leave." And she understood that the man she loved was not asking her to apologize for a misunderstanding. He was asking her to become silent. He was asking her to say, publicly, in front of everyone in that room, that truth mattered less than his family's comfort. That Edmund Fairfax's reputation was worth more than the soldiers who weren't receiving money they had been promised. That her knowledge, her careful work, her months of honest service meant nothing next to the word of a man his family had chosen to trust. He was asking her to become smaller so that everyone else could stay comfortable. Clara reached across the table. She picked up her gloves. She put them on slowly and deliberately, one finger at a time. "Then I will leave," she said. She did not pack in a panic. She went to her room, opened her trunk, and packed with the same quiet, methodical calm she brought to everything. Her books, her clothes, her father's writing desk, which she wrapped carefully in her gray wool shawl. The hidden copy of the documents she had compiled, folded into the lining of her smallest bag. One of the kitchen girls, a young woman named Dottie, found her in the corridor carrying her trunk toward the front door. Dottie's eyes went wide. "Miss Whitmore, are you leaving?" "Yes," Clara said. "But where will you go?" "I'll manage," Clara said. And then, because Dottie looked genuinely frightened on her behalf, "I've managed before." She walked out through the front door of Caldwell Estate in the late afternoon heat, carrying everything she owned, and she did not look back. Nathaniel watched her go from the upstairs window. He told himself she would come back. She had no money, no connections in town, no family to go to. The heat was brutal. She was proud, but she wasn't foolish. She would spend one uncomfortable night somewhere, and realize that her position at Caldwell Estate was the best she was going to find in this part of Virginia. And she would come back in the morning and make her apology, and everyone would move forward. He watched her walk down the long drive, her back straight, her step unhurried, until the tree line swallowed her and she was gone. He turned away from the window. Edmund Fairfax appeared at his elbow, quiet and sympathetic. "Unfortunate business," Edmund said, "but necessary. A household cannot function without trust." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It cannot." He went back to his study. He sat down at his desk. He looked at the afternoon accounts on the desk in front of him. He told himself he felt certain. He did not feel certain. There was something that had been sitting in his chest since the moment Clara laid those documents on his desk in March, a small, uncomfortable weight, like a stone he kept picking up and putting back down and picking up again. He was an intelligent man. He had not gotten where he was by being unable to read a ledger. He had looked at the figures Clara presented. He had understood what they implied. He had also understood, in that same moment, exactly what would happen if he allowed himself to believe them. 11 years of trust collapsed, his father's choice of a manager discredited. The family's public reputation as charitable benefactors to veterans destroyed or at minimum badly damaged. The Caldwell name, which Nathaniel had spent his entire adult life protecting and building, dragged through precisely the kind of scandal he had always believed happened to other, less careful families. It was too much, the cost was too high, so he had chosen Edmund. He had chosen the version of the story that let him keep everything. And he had asked Clara Whitmore to help him keep it by staying quiet. She had refused. He picked up his pen. He put it down. He looked out the window at the empty drive. He told himself she would be back by morning. She was not back by morning. She was not back the following morning, or the one after that. A week passed, then two. Nathaniel sent a discreet inquiry through Reverend Howell, not asking after Clara directly, just asking whether she had found a situation in town. The Reverend's response was brief and carefully neutral. Miss Whitmore had secured a position as a translator and bookkeeper for a small merchant firm on the eastern side of Richmond. She appeared to be well. Nathaniel read the letter 3 times. Then he put it away and told himself he was relieved. In August, a letter arrived from a widow in Richmond. A Mrs. Eliza Sutter, the wife of a soldier who had died in the war, who had applied to the Caldwell Soldiers' Relief Fund more than 18 months ago and received nothing. She was not the first person who had written to the estate about the fund. There had been other letters over the past years, which Edmund had always handled, with assurances and explanations and patient correspondence that apparently resolved the matter, because no further letters had come. One had reached Nathaniel directly, because it had been addressed not to the estate office, but to Mr. Nathaniel Caldwell personally in the matter of a serious concern. He read it, then he sat very still in his chair for a long time. Then he went to the estate office and pulled every piece of correspondence relating to the Soldiers' Relief Fund for the past 4 years. Edmund was not in the office. Edmund was inspecting the south field with the farm manager. Nathaniel sat down alone among the files. He started reading. By the time Edmund Fairfax returned to the house 3 hours later, Nathaniel Caldwell was standing at the window of the estate office with a stack of letters in his hand and an expression on his face that Edmund had never seen before. Edmund stopped in the doorway. "Sir," he said carefully. "Is everything all right?" Nathaniel turned around. "Sit down, Edmund," he said. His voice was very quiet. Completely controlled. The way a man's voice goes when he is holding something so large and so terrible that he cannot afford to let it break through the surface, because if it does, he doesn't know what will come out. Edmund sat down. Nathaniel placed the letters on the desk in front of him. Pacific letters. Letters from 4 separate veterans' widows, each describing payments promised and never received. Letters Edmund had responded to, reassuringly, and then apparently insured went no further. "These women wrote to this estate," Nathaniel said. "You told them their applications were under review. Some of them waited more than 2 years. There were complications," Edmund began. "Administrative don't." Nathaniel's voice was still quiet. "Don't do that. Don't sit in that chair and look at me and tell me about administrative complications. I have been reviewing these records for 3 hours. I know what I'm looking at." Edmund was silent. "She was right," Nathaniel said. "It came out flat, like something had gone out of him. She came to me in March, and she showed me the figures and she told me exactly what had happened, and I chose you." He looked at Edmund. "I chose you over her, sir. I understand this looks." "Don't." Nathaniel's control slipped just for a moment, one word sharp as a split plank, and then he pulled it back. "Don't talk to me right now. I need you to leave this office and not go anywhere on this property until I have spoken with my solicitor." Edmund opened his mouth. "Now," Nathaniel said. Edmund left. Nathaniel stood alone in the estate office. On the desk in front of him was the document Clara had compiled, the copy he had kept, meaning to look at it and never quite doing so. He had found it in his own desk drawer that afternoon, beneath a stack of correspondence he'd been ignoring. Her handwriting was careful and precise, every figure sourced. Every discrepancy numbered and dated. She had done everything right. She had come to him, done everything right, told him the truth as plainly and honestly as it was possible to tell it, and he had put his family's comfort above her integrity and made her apologize for it. And when she refused, he had told her to leave. He looked at her handwriting on the page. He thought about her face in the dining hall, that moment when she looked at him, and understood, and did not cry, and did not beg, and simply said, "Then I will leave." the stone that had been sitting in his chest for months cracked open. For the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel Caldwell did not feel certain at all. He felt like a man who had been completely and irreversibly wrong, and who had no idea what to do with that knowledge except carry it. He dealt with Edmund. He did it quietly. He was still, in the end, a Caldwell, and he managed his disasters with discretion. Edmund was removed from the estate. The matter was turned over to the solicitor. A portion of the misappropriated funds were recovered. Arrangements were made to compensate the veterans' families, as much as possible, for what had been taken from them. The Caldwell name survived, barely. With some careful management of the narrative and a great deal of direct personal correspondence to the affected families, the scandal was contained to whispers rather than headlines. His mother said very little, which was worse than if she had said a great deal. His brother William said even less, except once quietly, when they were alone, "You should find her, Nathaniel." "I know," Nathaniel said. "She was right about everything." "I know." William looked at him. "Do you know what you're going to say to her?" Nathaniel thought about the dining hall. He thought about the way her hands had gone flat against the table. He thought about her packing her trunk calmly, in the heat, and walking out the front door with everything she owned and not looking back once. "No," he said honestly, "not yet." He needed to know she was all right before he said anything. So he went back to Reverend Howell. The Reverend received him with the careful, measured courtesy of a man who had his own opinions about the situation and was being very disciplined about not voicing them. "She is well," the Reverend said. "She has made a respectable place for herself." "Is she happy?" The Reverend considered this. "I think she is learning what it means to belong entirely to herself." "I think that is a different thing than happy, and perhaps more important." Nathaniel sat with that. "Does she?" He stopped, started again. "Has she said anything about the estate, about—" "She has not," the Reverend said. "Miss Whitmore does not waste time on things she cannot change." He walked home from the Reverend's house in the August heat, down a road he had walked 100 times without paying any attention to it, and this time he looked at everything: the dry grass at the verge, the way the light came through the trees, the sound of a creek somewhere off to the left that he had never noticed before. He had spent a long time, he realized, walking through his own life without paying attention to it, without asking whether what he was protecting was actually worth protecting, without listening to people who were telling him true things. He thought about Clara's voice in his office in March, even careful, precise. "I am asking you to have the records independently reviewed." Nothing more. Nothing more. She hadn't even been asking him to believe her completely. She had only been asking him to look, and he had looked and seen and turned away. He stopped walking. The road stretched ahead of him, empty in the heat haze. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned around and went home, and began composing the most difficult letter he had ever written in his life. He tore it up 4 times before he accepted that no letter was going to be sufficient. He was going to have to go to her himself, but not yet. Not until he had done what needed to be done. Not until he was the kind of man who had something worth saying. Not until he had something more to offer her than an apology and a restored reputation and the money and name that she had already proved, conclusively, that she did not need. He went back inside. He went to his desk. He started working. The room Clara rented in Richmond was not much larger than the closet she had used to store household records at Caldwell Estate. It had one window that faced a brick wall. The floorboards creaked in 3 separate places, and the landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Pratt, made it her personal mission to remind Clara of the house rules every single morning, as though Clara had spent the night actively plotting to break them. "No visitors after 7, Mrs. Pratt said on the first morning, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "No cooking in the room, no excessive noise, and rent is due on Friday, not Saturday, not Sunday." "Friday understood," Clara said. "You're young to be on your own, Mrs." Pratt added, looking her over with the particular expression of a woman deciding whether to pity someone or disapprove of them. "I'm 26, Clara said. "That's what I said." "Young." Mrs. Pratt turned and walked back down the stairs, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. Clara closed the door. She stood in the center of that small room with her trunk against the wall, and her father's writing desk wedged beneath the window, and she breathed. She did not cry. She had decided somewhere on the long walk away from Caldwell Estate that she was done crying over things she could not change. She could not change what Nathaniel Caldwell had chosen. She could not change Edmund Fairfax or Margaret Caldwell, or the entire polished, indifferent machinery of a wealthy family protecting itself. What she could change was what happened next. She sat down at her father's desk, opened her notebook, and wrote 3 columns across the top of the page. What I have. What I need. What I can do. Under what I have, she wrote her books, her skills, the copy of the documents hidden in her bag, and approximately $4.60 in coin. Under what I need, she wrote income, within the week. Under what I can do, she wrote accounting, translation, correspondence, teaching. She looked at the page for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, picked up her coat despite the August heat, and went out to find work. It took her 4 days. 4 days of walking into merchant offices and small law practices and being looked at with everything from polite confusion to outright dismissal. A woman bookkeeper, a woman with no current employer reference, no husband, no male relative to vouch for her character. She was too well-spoken to be dismissed entirely, and too female to be taken seriously without substantial resistance. On the second day, a cotton merchant named Mr. Abels told her she was very capable seeming, but that he wouldn't feel comfortable having a woman handle his accounts. He said it pleasantly, as though he were doing her a favor by explaining the problem clearly. Clara thanked him politely and left. On the third day, a law clerk told her he'd be happy to employ her as a copyist at half the rate he paid the male copyists, because, he explained, she wouldn't be supporting a family. Neither are most of your male copyists, Clara said. He looked startled, as though no one had ever pointed that out before. Nevertheless, he said, Clara left. On the 4th day, she walked into the office of a small import firm called Waverley & Sons, run by a man named George Waverley who was 63 years old, nearly deaf in his left ear, and possessed of 2 adult sons who had moved to Georgia and shown no interest in the family business. He needed someone who could handle correspondence in French. He had a supplier in New Orleans, and maintain his accounts. He looked at Clara over his spectacles for a long moment after she made her case. Can you actually read French, he said, or are you saying you can? Je peux lire, écrire et parler le français couramment, Clara said. I can also read basic Latin, and I can calculate your quarterly figures faster than whoever last held this position, assuming someone did. George Waverley blinked. The last person who held this position, he said, was my son Harold. He was terrible at figures, and his French was mostly invented. Then I am an improvement, Clara said. George Waverley hired her on the spot, at a wage that was not generous but was honest, and told her she could start Monday. Clara walked back to her rented room and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of sitting on the edge of her bed, with her hands pressed over her face in pure, exhausted relief. Then she got up and wrote a letter to Reverend Howell, letting him know she was situated and safe. She did not write to anyone at Caldwell Estate. She was not going to make the mistake of looking backward when everything that mattered was in front of her. But she thought about it. That was the part she hadn't planned for how much she would think about it. In the spaces between tasks in the quiet of the evening when Mrs. Pratt's house settled around her, and the brick wall outside her window went dark, she found herself going over the dining hall scene with the compulsive, unwilling repetition of someone pressing a bruise to check whether it still hurt. It still hurt, not the dismissal. She could bear the dismissal. She had been dismissed by people in power before, and she had learned that dismissal from someone whose judgment you've lost respect for is not the same thing as failure. What hurt was the moment just before it. The moment when Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her across that table and she saw clearly, unmistakably, that he had already made his choice. That he had sat with the knowledge for 3 months and decided it was less painful to doubt her than to confront what the alternative would cost him. That was the thing that lodged in her chest like a splinter. Not that he had been wrong. People were wrong all the time. But that he had known somewhere, in the part of himself he kept very quiet and chosen wrongness anyway. She put it away. She was good at that. She put it in the same internal space where she kept her father's debt, and her family's ruin, and all the other things that had happened to her that she hadn't chosen and couldn't change. She organized them neatly. She closed the door on them. She went to work. The work, as it turned out, was the thing that saved her. Not saved her financially, though it did that too. But saved her in the more fundamental sense of giving her somewhere to put her intelligence and her energy that was entirely her own. At Caldwell Estate, she had been careful. She had kept herself contained and modest and undemanding, because that was the only acceptable posture for a woman in her position inside that particular household. She had done her work well, but she had done it quietly, taking up as little space as possible, making herself easy to overlook. At Waverley & Sons there was no one to perform modesty for. George Waverley didn't care about her comportment. He cared whether the New Orleans correspondence was handled correctly and whether the quarterly figures balanced. When she reorganized his filing system in her second week because the original system was functionally incoherent, he looked at it for a moment and said, "That's better." Why didn't Harold do that, and walked away? She started arriving early. She started thinking about improvements beyond what she was asked for: better processes, clearer records, a more systematic approach to tracking inventory against invoices. She brought George a proposal, written out in 2 clear pages, suggesting a way to reduce their losses from delayed shipments by adjusting their payment schedule with the New Orleans supplier. George read it carefully. He read it a second time. "Where did you study?" he asked. "I didn't," Clara said. "I kept my own family's accounts from the time I was 15. And I spent 8 months at a large estate in this county." "Which estate?" A brief pause. "Caldwell." George looked at her over his spectacles. He was a man who had lived 63 years and seen a great many things, and had learned when not to ask follow-up questions. "All right," he said. He handed the proposal back to her. Do it. She did it. It worked. Within 2 months, the delayed shipment losses had dropped by almost a third. George gave her a small raise. He announced it the way he announced most things, brusquely, without ceremony, as though it were a minor administrative detail. "I'm increasing your wage. You've earned it. Don't make a fuss about it." "I wouldn't dream of it," Clara said. She went back to her desk and very quietly allowed herself to feel something that was not exactly happiness, but was in the same neighborhood, a solid, earned, uncomplicated satisfaction that belonged to no one but her. For the first time in her life, every small good thing she had was something she had built herself. No one could take it from her by withdrawing their goodwill. No one could dismantle it by choosing to believe someone else. It was hers, completely and only hers. She thought of Nathaniel Caldwell sometimes still. She thought of him in the way you think of a country you once loved and had to leave with a grief that wasn't sharp anymore, just deep and quiet and persistent. She didn't hate him. She had tried to examine whether she hated him, and she couldn't find it. What she found instead was something more complicated, the sorrow of watching someone choose smallness when you know they're capable of more. She hoped, in some distant, private part of herself, that he would find his way to more. But she was no longer willing to wait for it. That was the change in her. She could feel it in herself, the way you can feel a bone that is broken and healed, not weaker, but differently structured. She was no longer willing to organize her life around the possibility of someone else's becoming. She had her own becoming to attend to. Meanwhile, the town of Richmond had opinions about Clara Whitmore. Opinions in a town like Richmond in the summer of 1814 traveled fast and arrived pre-shaped. Someone had talked, she didn't know who, didn't particularly care, and the version of events that circulated through drawing rooms and church vestibules and the counters of dry goods stores was not kind to her. She had made accusations against a respected man. She had been found to be mistaken. She had behaved improperly and been dismissed from one of the finest households in Virginia. She was, depending on who was telling the story, either foolishly proud or dangerously ambitious. or simply a woman who had gotten above herself and been appropriately corrected. She knew about the rumors because Dottie, the kitchen girl from Caldwell Estate, who had a cousin in Richmond, and a conscience that apparently kept her up at night, sent Clara a letter. It was short and phonetically spelled and slightly smudged, but its meaning was clear. "People are saying things, Mistu, and I thought you should know." Clara read the letter twice, thanked Dottie in her mind for the warning, and then went about her day. The rumors had teeth, though. She felt them. She felt them in the way certain women at church looked past her rather than at her. In the way an acquaintance of her mother's, a Mrs. Vickers, stopped to tell her with elaborate false sympathy that she had heard about the unfortunate situation at the Caldwell estate and hoped Clara had learned from the experience. In the way a man at the merchant exchange, on hearing her name, said something quietly to the man beside him, and both of them looked at her with the same assessing, dismissive expression. She had been tried in absentia and found guilty of something she wasn't entirely sure what. Either lying or pride or simply the crime of having caused inconvenience to a powerful family. What she noticed, observing herself, was that the rumors hurt less than she had expected. Not because they were painless, they weren't, but because she had spent her adult life building herself on the foundation of what she actually knew to be true. And that foundation did not shift when people said things about her that were false. The truth was she had been right. She didn't need anyone else to know that. She just needed to know it herself. There was one afternoon in September that tested her more than most. She was leaving Waverley and Sons after a long day when she nearly walked directly into Caldwell on the pavement outside the dry goods store next door. Nathaniel's mother, accompanied by a woman Clara didn't know, and a household servant carrying packages. They saw each other at the same moment. Margaret Caldwell was 61 years old, a handsome woman in the way that certain Virginia matriarchs were handsome, composed, and permanent, like a formal portrait. She had the same dark eyes as her son, and she wore her authority the way she wore her clothing, with complete, unconscious certainty that it was simply how things were. She looked at Clara. Clara looked back. For exactly 3 seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret Caldwell drew herself up. She was already straight, but she drew herself up further, in a particular way that communicated an entire dissertation on social hierarchy, and said, in a clear, carrying voice, "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Caldwell," Clara said. Another pause. The woman beside Margaret was watching with bright, avid eyes. The servant looked at the middle distance with determined neutrality. "I trust you are finding suitable employment," Margaret said. Her tone was not cruel. It was something more precise than cruel. It was the tone of someone who has already assigned you to a category and is addressing you accordingly. "Very suitable," Clara said. "Thank you, good." Margaret nodded with the finality of someone concluding a mildly unpleasant administrative task. "Good day, then." She walked past. Clara stood on the pavement and breathed. Her hands were completely steady. She noticed that. She was proud of that privately, in the way she was privately proud of all the small dignities she managed to keep intact. But her heart was beating very fast, not with fear. With something that had no clean name, a complicated mixture of grief and anger, and the particular ache of being looked at by someone who had been in a position to see you clearly and had chosen not to. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she went home, sat at her father's desk, and wrote 3 pages in her private journal, the one she kept for herself alone. The one no one would ever read, about everything she was thinking and feeling, and was not going to allow herself to say out loud. She wrote it all, the anger, the grief, the stubborn, unkillable hope that somewhere in that family there was a person capable of decency. She closed the journal. She made herself a small supper on the communal kitchen stove, ignoring Mrs. Pratt's commentary on the correct way to prepare a proper Virginia meal. She went to bed. She woke up the next morning and went to work. This was how she survived, not through any dramatic act of resistance, but through the radical, daily choice to keep going, to keep building the life that was hers, one ordinary day at a time. When every convenient social structure was designed to convince her it couldn't be done. At the end of September, something happened that she had not expected. A letter arrived at Waverley and Sons, addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a short note, unsigned, that read, "The Soldiers' Relief Fund discrepancy has been investigated. The findings confirmed the original analysis. The responsible party has been removed from his position, and appropriate action has been taken. The affected families are being compensated." That was all. No name, no explanation of who had sent it. Clara read the letter 3 times. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she folded the letter carefully, placed it inside her notebook, and went back to the French correspondence she'd been drafting for the New Orleans supplier. George Waverly glanced at her from across the office. "Everything all right?" Clara said. She didn't elaborate. But something in her, the tightly coiled thing she had been carrying since March, the thing made of frustrated certainty and unacknowledged grief, relaxed by one small significant degree. She had been right. It had been confirmed. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel triumphant if this moment ever came, but what she actually felt was quieter than that and more complicated. She felt sad in a way she hadn't quite allowed herself to feel before. Because being confirmed right meant the money had truly been stolen. It meant those women, those soldiers' wives, had truly been waiting for help that was never going to come. It meant Edmund Fairfax had been exactly what the numbers suggested. It meant Nathaniel Caldwell had sat with the evidence for 3 months and chosen to believe the wrong person. It meant all of it had been exactly as real as she had known it to be, and for a little while she had been the only person willing to say so. That was a lonely thing. That was a very lonely thing. She allowed herself to feel that for exactly the length of time it took to draft the first paragraph of the New Orleans letter. Then she put it away. October arrived. The heat finally broke. The air went from suffocating to merely warm, and then to something approaching pleasant, and Clara noticed that she had been in Richmond for 3 months and was beginning to know its rhythms. She knew which stalls at the market had the freshest produce, and which were presenting last week's goods with this week's prices. She knew that the 3rd floorboard from the left in Mrs. Pratt's hallway was the one most likely to wake the landlady if you stepped on it after 8 in the evening. She knew that George Waverly was never truly unreachable before 10 in the morning, and that the best time to bring him a problem was directly after his 2nd cup of coffee. She knew the texture of her own life now, which she had not known before, because it had always been organized around someone else's requirements. It was a strange, uncomfortable, nourishing knowledge. Reverend Howell visited her in October, under the guise of making his regular pastoral rounds through the boarding houses of his congregation. He had tea with Clara in Mrs. Pratt's communal sitting room, while Mrs. Pratt very obviously occupied herself with sewing in the opposite corner of the same room. "You look well," the Reverend said. "I am well," Clara said. He looked at her carefully. "Truly," she paused. "It is not easy, but it is real. Everything I have is real." The Reverend nodded. He turned his teacup in his hands. "I have heard from Nathaniel Caldwell," he said in the careful tone of a man reporting a fact and reserving judgment on what it means. Clara was quiet for a moment. Across the room, Mrs. Pratt's sewing needle went still and then resumed. "What did he say?" Clara asked. "He asked whether you were all right." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were well and building a respectable life." The Reverend paused. "He also asked if you were happy." Clara looked at her tea. "What did you tell him?" she said again, more quietly. "I told him that I thought you were learning what it meant to belong entirely to yourself. And that I thought that was perhaps more important than happiness, for now." Clara sat with that for a moment. "That was a very good answer," she said. "I thought so." The Reverend set down his teacup. "He will come eventually." "I think you know that," maybe Clara said. "What will you do when he does?" Clara looked at the window. Through it, she could see the ordinary street outside, the people passing, the unremarkable afternoon proceeding with its unremarkable errands, completely indifferent to any of this. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'll know when it happens. Or I won't, and I'll figure it out then." The Reverend smiled. It was a small, warm smile with a great deal in it. "You know," he said, "you are not at all what anyone expected." No, Clara agreed. I never have been. She walked him to the door when he left, and stood in the cool October air for a moment after he was gone. She thought about Nathaniel Caldwell asking the Reverend whether she was happy. She thought about what it meant that he was asking. She thought about what it would have meant 3 months ago, and what it meant now, after 3 months of building something that was entirely her own. It meant less than it would have then, and it meant more. Both things at once. That was the part no one ever prepared you for, how love didn't resolve itself cleanly. How you could still carry it, quiet and persistent, even after you'd walked away from everything it was attached to. How it didn't require anything from you to keep existing. It just sat there in its corner of your chest, doing nothing in particular except reminding you it was there. She didn't know what she'd do when he came. She knew she would not fall apart. She was past the place where that could happen. She went back inside. She had correspondence to finish before Friday. In November, 3 things happened in quick succession that changed the shape of everything. The first, a young woman named Patience Arlo came to Waverly and Sons looking for a translation job. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a French-speaking family from New Orleans, who had come to Virginia for her mother's health, and she spoke English with a lilting accent and looked at Clara with the wide, unguarded expression of someone who hadn't yet learned to be strategic about who they trusted. Clara hired her on George's authority. George had given Clara increasing latitude over such decisions and spent the next 3 weeks realizing that having another woman in the office changed the quality of the air in a way she hadn't known she was missing. Patience was quick and warm, and had a talent for diffusing awkward moments with a kind of cheerful, genuine charm that Clara, who diffused awkward moments through precision and composure, found completely baffling and rather wonderful. They became friends in the way that people become friends when they are both, in their different ways, navigating a world that wasn't designed with them in mind quickly, specifically, and with a candor that surprised them both. The second thing, George Waverly had a heart episode. It was not a serious one, the doctor said, but it was a warning. He needed to reduce his hours. His son Harold wrote from Georgia, expressing concern and suggesting George consider selling the firm. George told Harold, in a return letter, that Clara transcribed with her best neutral professional face, that he would consider selling the firm approximately at the same time that certain geological formations experience significant thermal events. He then looked at Clara over his spectacles. I need to restructure my affairs, he said. I would like your assistance with this, of course, Clara said. And I would like to discuss your future role here. Your responsibilities have already expanded considerably beyond the original position. I think we should formalize that. Clara looked at him. Are you offering me a partnership? She said. I'm offering you a formal management position with the stake in the profits, George said, with the air of a man being very precise. Call it what you like. I'll call it a partnership, Clara said. George gave a small nod. All right, call it that. She didn't sleep that night. Not from anxiety, from the roaring, barely containable feeling of something enormous and real taking shape. She lay in her small room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the woman who had walked out of Caldwell Estate in the August heat with $4.60 and her father's writing desk, and the woman she was right now. The third thing that happened in November was Nathaniel Caldwell. She was crossing the market square on a Wednesday morning, carrying a package for George, when she heard her name. She knew his voice before she turned. She had always known his voice, something in the register of it, the particular quality of how he said her name, as though it were a complete sentence. She turned. He was standing 10 feet away, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not resolved, not careful, not certain. He looked like a man who had rehearsed a great many things to have found, at the actual moment, that none of them were adequate. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Caldwell, she said. People moved around them in the ordinary tide of the market, indifferent. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as though he wasn't sure he had permission. You look well, he said. I am well. A pause. He turned his hat in his hands. Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name without any formal preface. It landed like something dropped. "I have been trying," he said, "to think of what to say to you. I've been trying for some time now, and I have not." He stopped. "Try it again. There is nothing I can say that is proportionate. I know that. But I needed you to know that I found out the truth, and I know," Clara said. "I received a letter." Something moved across his face. "I wasn't sure if." He stopped again. "I didn't sign it. I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me." "No," she said quietly. "You weren't sure." The words were gentle, but they landed precisely where she meant them to. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, the slight contraction around his eyes, the way he looked down at the hat in his hands and then back up at her. "I was wrong," he said. "Not explanation, not justification. Just the fact, plain and direct, with nothing around it. I was wrong about Edmund, and I was wrong to ask you for that apology, and I was wrong to let you walk out that door. And I have thought about it every day since." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Around them the market went on. Someone called out a price. A horse shifted on the cobblestones. A child ran past with something clutched to its chest. "What is it that you want, Mr. Caldwell?" she said finally. "Steady, honest. When you came here today, what were you hoping for?" He looked at her, that direct look she had always found honest. "I want to be someone worthy of standing in front of you and saying, 'I'm sorry,'" he said. "And I'm not sure yet that I am, but I am trying." Clara looked at him for a long moment, this man, this proud, capable, flawed, finally trying man. Something in her, that deeply buried, stubbornly persistent thing, shifted. Not toward him, not yet, but it moved. "I have work to get back to," she said. He nodded immediately, stepping back, of course. She started to go, then she stopped. "The Reverend told me you asked whether I was happy," she said, without turning around. A pause behind her. "Yes, I am not unhappy," she said. "I am building something that is entirely mine. It is the first time that has been true." She heard him take a breath. "Good," he said. His voice was rough. That's good, Clara." She walked away. She did not look back. But she was aware, all the way across the market square and back to the offices of Waverly and Sons, of the feeling in her chest, not the old grief, not the old anger, but something newer and more uncertain than either. Something that required, she thought, a great deal more time and a great deal more watching before she knew what to do with it. She went back to her desk. She picked up her pen. She got back to work. He came back, not the next day, not the next week. But he came back, and Clara had known he would, the same way she had known, walking away from the market square with her package tucked under her arm and her pulse running faster than she wanted to admit, that the conversation in November had not been an ending. It had been a beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. He came on a Tuesday morning in early December to Waverly and Sons, which meant he had asked someone where she worked. That small fact sat in her mind with more weight than she wanted to give it. He had asked. He had found out. He had come in person rather than sending a letter, which meant he understood that a letter would be too easy to ignore. She was at her desk when Patience appeared in the doorway of the back office with an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral and failing in exactly the way a 19-year-old's face fails when it is attempting professional neutrality. "There is a gentleman here," Patience said carefully. "He says he does not have an appointment, but that he hopes you might spare a few minutes." "Who is it?" Clara asked, though she already knew. Mr. Nathaniel Caldwell. George Waverly, sitting at the opposite desk, looked up from his correspondence. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at her current page of figures. "Show him in," she said. She heard Patience's footsteps retreat, and then the different, heavier footsteps of someone crossing the outer office, and then Nathaniel Caldwell was standing in the doorway of the back office of Waverly and Sons, hat in hand again, looking slightly too large for the room, the way that certain men look slightly too large for any space that wasn't built specifically for their confidence. He glanced at George. George did not look up from his correspondence, though Clara noticed that his page had not earned in the past 3 minutes. "Mr. Caldwell," Clara said. Her voice was steady. "Please sit." He sat in the wooden chair across from her desk. He looked at her directly, which she had always appreciated about him. He never looked away to avoid a thing. "I came," he said, "because I realized after the market that I asked for your time and gave you nothing worth the giving of it. Just a statement of fact. I was wrong. That is true. But the truth of it doesn't explain anything, and I think you are owed an explanation." George's correspondence rustled. "Go ahead," Clara said. "I knew," Nathaniel said. His voice was quiet and deliberate. "In March, when you showed me those figures, I knew they were correct. I understood what they meant. I wasn't confused. I wasn't doubting your calculations. I knew." Clara went very still. This was not what she had expected. She had expected excuses. She had built herself a small, careful wall of expectation against excuses, and now he was saying something that made the wall irrelevant. "You knew," she said. "Yes. And you still asked me to apologize." "Yes." He didn't flinch, "because believing you meant destroying something I had spent my entire life building. Edmund had served my family since my father's time. The fund it was the thing we were most publicly known for. Our generosity, our integrity. If Edmund was stealing from it, then the reputation was a lie. The public dinners, the newspaper articles, my father's trust in the man. All of it a lie." He paused. "I wasn't ready to be a man who lived inside that particular truth." Clara looked at him. Something in her was very, very angry. She had known she was right. She had always known. But there is a difference between knowing you were right and hearing the person who doubted you confirm, in plain words, that they always knew it too. That the doubt was never real. That what she had experienced as doubt was actually a choice. "So you chose Edmund," she said, "not because you believed him, but because believing me was more expensive." "Yes," he said. "One word, no decoration. That is exactly what I did." The room was very quiet. George's pen scratched once across his page and stopped. "And you asked me," Clara said carefully, her voice dropping to something very controlled and precise, "to apologize. Knowing I was right, knowing I was telling you the truth. You stood in that dining hall and you asked me to say, in front of your family, in front of Edmund Fairfax, that I was wrong." "Yes. Do you understand what that was?" she said. "Not the mistake of a man who was confused. You were asking me to lie. Deliberately, knowingly. You were asking me to protect something you already knew was false." His jaw tightened. "Yes, I understand that now. Do you understand it cost me everything I had?" Her voice didn't rise. It went quieter, sharper. "My position, my reference. My reputation in this town. I walked out of your house with $4, and I spent 4 days looking for work while people told me to my face that no respectable household would employ me now. Because I had made accusations against a good man." The word landed like a flat stone. "That was what they called him, a good man." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment. "Clara, I am not finished," she said. He opened his eyes. He listened. "I am not telling you this so that you will feel worse than you already feel," she said. "I am telling you because you came here wanting to give me an explanation, and I think if you're going to give me one, it should include all of it. Not just the abstract acknowledgement that you were wrong, but this, what the choice cost, what it actually meant for a real person who was not protected by a family name or an estate or 11 years of accumulated trust." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. And then, rougher, "I know, and I do not have anything to give you that makes it right. I understand that. I'm not here to make it right. I'm not sure it can be made right. I'm here because," he stopped, his hands pressed flat against his knees, "because I needed you to know that I understand what I did. Not the surface of it, the whole of it, and because I have spent the past 4 months trying to become a man who would not make that choice again, and I'm not finished, but I am further along than I was." Clara looked at him. The anger was still there. It didn't dissolve. It didn't need to dissolve. It had been a true and legitimate anger, and she had earned every part of it, and it could coexist with other things. "What have you been doing?" she said. "These 4 months." He told her. Not defensively, not with the self-congratulatory edge of someone recounting their own improvement. Just plainly. He had restructured the estate accounts with an outside auditor. He had personally visited each of the veterans' families and arranged compensation from his own funds, not the estate funds, not the recovered money, but his own. He had been going every week to the soldiers' hospital at the edge of Richmond to help coordinate the supply deliveries that the relief fund now properly administered. "You go yourself," she said. "Every week," he said. "William thinks I've lost my mind. My mother thinks it's beneath my station." "What do you think?" Something shifted in his face. "I think I have spent 35 years being very certain about what is and isn't beneath my station. And I think that certainty cost me considerably more than it ever protected." Clara was quiet for a moment. "The hospital," she said. "Which one?" "St. Andrew's on the East Road." She knew it. She had walked past it. "I know a woman," she said slowly. "Mrs. Eliza Sutter. Her husband died in the war. She was one of the families who wrote to your estate about the fund." Nathaniel went very still. "I know her name. I wrote to her personally." "I visited her." Clara looked at him sharply. "You visited her?" "In September." His voice was careful. "She has 3 children. The eldest is 8. She was very gracious, considering." "More gracious than I deserved." Clara felt something move in her chest. Not the anger. Something different. Something that was working its way around the anger, not dismissing it, but sitting beside it. "She didn't tell me," Clara said. "I asked her not to," he said. "I wasn't. I didn't want you to hear about it from someone else. I wanted to tell you myself when I was ready. And are you ready now?" "I'm not sure I'll ever be entirely ready," he said. "But I'm done letting not being ready be a reason to wait." He stood. He placed his hat back on. He looked at her with that direct, steady look. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not standing here with an agenda. I needed you to know the whole of it. And I needed to hear you say that you heard it. Whatever you do with it after that is entirely your choice." Clara looked up at him. "I heard it," she said. He nodded. "Once, and then he walked out." Patience was standing very attentively at her desk in the outer office, staring at a document she had clearly not been reading. When Nathaniel had gone and the door had closed behind him, she turned and looked at Clara with enormous eyes. "Don't," Clara said. "I didn't say anything," Patience said. "You were about to." Patience pressed her lips together. Then with great restraint, "He is very handsome." "That is not relevant. It is slightly relevant." "It is not even slightly relevant," Clara said firmly, and went back to her figures. But that night, alone in her small room, she took out her journal and wrote for a very long time. She wrote about what it meant to be told you were right. She wrote about the difference between an apology that asked for something and an apology that asked for nothing. She wrote about the particular difficulty of continuing to be angry at someone who was visibly, genuinely trying. She wrote, "He knew, he always knew. That part is not forgiven. I don't think it can be forgiven quickly, and I will not pretend it can. But I think he is becoming someone who would not do it again. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what I am supposed to do with that." She closed the journal. She went to sleep. December deepened. Christmas came and went quietly. Clara spent it with the Reverend's family, which was warm and a little chaotic and full of children, and exactly the kind of uncomplicated human warmth she hadn't known she needed. Patience sent a small package of French confections from her mother, which Clara and George ate over 2 consecutive afternoons with the contented silence of people who have worked together long enough not to need conversation. The new year arrived, 1815. In January, Nathaniel Caldwell sent her a letter. Not about anything personal. He wrote to say that St. Andrew's Hospital was attempting to organize a system for tracking their supply inventory, and that it was in considerable disarray, and that Waverly and Sons had been recommended to him as a firm with expertise in organizational systems. And would Miss Whitmore be willing to consult on the matter in a professional capacity, at a professional rate? Clara read the letter twice, then she showed it to George. George read it. He set it down. He looked at her over his spectacles in that particular way he had. "He's found a very clever way to give you a reason to talk to him," George said. "It's also a legitimate business inquiry," Clara said. Both things, George agreed, can be true, she wrote back. She said she would be pleased to consult on the matter, and proposed a rate and an initial meeting time. Professional, precise, giving nothing extra, she went to St. Andrews the following week. She had thought she was prepared. She had thought, after months of managing her own reactions with care and intelligence, that she could walk into that hospital and assess the inventory system and do the work without the situation becoming complicated. She had underestimated what it would feel like to see Nathaniel Caldwell doing something purely good with no audience to see it. He was not there in an official capacity when she arrived. He was in the East Corridor, helping two orderlies carry a heavy supply crate, his coat off, his sleeves rolled up, working with the matter-of-fact physical effort of someone who was not thinking about whether this was beneath his station. He looked up when she came in. Something passed between them, just the recognition of seeing each other in an unexpected context, just a fraction of a second, and then she nodded. Professional, and he nodded back, and they both got to work. She spent 3 hours reviewing the inventory system. It was, as described, in considerable disarray, records in 3 different formats, no consistent labeling, supply orders that didn't match delivery logs. She took notes, she asked questions, she spoke to the head orderly and the administrator and one of the doctors. Nathaniel moved in and out of the space while she worked. He didn't hover, he didn't engineer moments. He simply did what he had apparently come to do, which was whatever needed doing, and acknowledged her presence exactly as much as the situation called for. It was, she thought, the most effective thing he could possibly have done. It was also, she was fairly sure, not calculated, which made it more effective still. She was finishing her notes when he came and stood a respectful distance away. "Do you have everything you need?" he asked. "I think so," she said. "I'll have a proposal drafted by the end of the week." "There's no urgency," he said. "Take whatever time you need." She looked at him. He was standing with the kind of ease that came from someone who had stopped performing a version of themselves. The rigid architecture of pride she remembered from Caldwell Estate was not gone, exactly, but looser. Like something that had been very tightly wound and had been through sustained effort, slowly unwound. "You come here every week," she said. "Tuesdays and Thursdays now," he said. William started coming on Thursdays. William, my brother. A small ghost of something warm moved across his face. He said if I was going to make a fool of myself in public, the least he could do was be there to witness it. "That doesn't sound like something William would say," she said before she'd thought about it. He looked slightly surprised. "You knew William? He used to bring the household correspondence to my office, rather than having it delivered," she said. "We talked sometimes. He never told me that." "No," she said. "I don't suppose he would." A pause, not uncomfortable. Something had shifted in the past 3 hours, in a way that was subtle, and not reversible. They were not the same two people who had stood in the market square in November. They had moved without quite agreeing to, into something more ordinary. The ordinary of two people who had known each other for some time, working alongside each other, and finding that the work felt natural. She was not going to rush anything. She had not come this far, built this carefully, survived this much, in order to lose herself in a rush of feeling. But she was also, she had to be honest with herself, she was not indifferent. She had never been indifferent. That was the problem and the truth of it. You do not walk out of someone's house refusing to apologize and spend 4 months building yourself back up from nothing and feel nothing. You feel an enormous amount. You just choose very carefully what you do with it. "I'll have the proposal to you by Friday," she said. "Thank you," he said. She left. Walking back through Richmond in the January cold, she thought about something Patience had said to her the week before, with the guileless directness that Clara was still sometimes ambushed by. They had been talking carefully, in the way Clara talked about personal things, with significant gaps where the most personal things lived, about Nathaniel Caldwell's visits to the office, and Patience had looked at her and said, very simply, "You still love him." Clara had not answered. Patience had not pressed. But the words walked alongside her now on the cold January road, and she did not try to argue with them. She loved him. She had always loved him. The love had not gone away when she left Caldwell Estate, and it had not gone away in the months of building her own life, and it had not gone away in the market square in November, or in the back office in December, or in the corridor of St. Andrews this afternoon. It had changed. It had grown quieter and more complicated and considerably more demanding. She had higher requirements for it now than she had 8 months ago. Requirements that came from knowing herself better and trusting herself more and understanding. With the hard-won clarity of someone who had lost a great deal and rebuilt exactly what she was and was not willing to accept. But it was still there. She was woman enough to admit that, at least to herself. The proposal for St. Andrews was delivered on Friday. It was accepted the following Monday. Work began the week after that, which meant Clara was at the hospital every Tuesday morning for the better part of January and into February. And Nathaniel was there every Tuesday. They worked. They talked about inventory systems, about supply chains, about the hospital's administrative needs. And then gradually they talked about other things. He told her about the estate changes he was implementing. She told him about the partnership with George Waverley. He told her about a conversation he'd had with the estate's tenant farmers that had gone unexpectedly well. She told him about a problem she'd solved in the New Orleans account. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, two people talking. It was also the most careful, significant, weight-bearing conversation she had ever been part of. Because under every exchange of ordinary information was the understanding of everything that had been broken and what it would take to build something new. In the second week of February, she arrived at St. Andrews to find Nathaniel already there and standing very still in the administrator's office, holding a letter. She knew from the quality of his stillness that it was not good news. "What is it?" she said. He handed her the letter without speaking. It was from Edmund Fairfax's solicitor. Edmund, it appeared, was contesting the removal and was threatening to file a legal claim against the Caldwell estate on the grounds of wrongful dismissal. The solicitor's letter was artful, carefully worded, making just enough implications without making direct accusations. But the implication was clear. Edmund intended to drag everything into open court, and in open court, the details of the Soldiers' Fund, the manner of the investigation, and the circumstances surrounding it would all become a matter of public record. Including, the letter strongly implied, the role of a certain female employee whose accusations had initiated the matter. Clara read the letter twice. "He's going to try to make this about me," she said. "Yes." Nathaniel's voice was flat and controlled. "He's going to argue that you had a personal motive to discredit him. That the accusations were malicious. That I acted improperly in dismissing him on the basis of claims from he stopped." From a disgruntled female employee with no standing, Clara said. "Yes." She handed the letter back. She looked at Nathaniel's face. He was holding himself very carefully, the way she recognized now as his particular form of trying not to let something break through that he wasn't ready to show. "What will you do?" she said. "Fight it," he said immediately. "Every piece of documentation you compiled, every letter from the veterans' families, every discrepancy, traced and sourced, I will put every single piece of it in front of whatever court Edmund chooses, and I will not—" He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "I will not let him do this to you." Clara looked at him. "It is not only about me," she said quietly. "No," he said, "it's about the truth, but it is also about you, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." She thought about it. She thought about standing in open court, about her name being discussed, about the version of events Edmund Fairfax's solicitor would construct, about the stories that were already circulating in Richmond being given a formal legal stage. She thought about $4.60 and a leather trunk and her father's writing desk. She thought about what she had built in the months since. "I have a second copy of the documentation," she said. He looked at her sharply. "I made it the night Edmund spoke to me in the corridor," she said. "When he made his little speech about loyalty and unfortunate misunderstandings. I knew then that he would try something eventually, so I made a second copy and hid it. I have had it since August." Nathaniel stared at her. "You've had a complete second copy of the documentation this entire time." Yes, where? In the lining of my smallest bag, she said. Under my father's writing paper. He looked at her for a long moment. And then something happened on his face that she had never seen there before. Not relief, though that was part of it. Something larger. Something that looked almost like the expression of a person who has just understood, completely and finally, exactly who they are dealing with. Clara Whitmore, he said slowly, you walked out of my house with $4 and a hidden copy of the evidence. Yes, in case you needed it someday. Yes, he let out a breath. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man discovering something that is simultaneously wonderful and devastating. Of course you did, he said. The solicitor received the documentation the following week. Edmund Fairfax withdrew his claim before the month was out. It was a Tuesday when Nathaniel told her, standing in the east corridor of St. Andrews, same as always. He handed her the solicitor's letter confirming the withdrawal. She read it. She handed it back. Good, she said. He was looking at her with that particular expression. That's all? Good? What else would you like me to say? I don't know, he said. Something proportionate to the fact that you had that documentation for 7 months and never once mentioned it. Not when people were talking about you. Not when my mother looked at you on the pavement. Not when it wasn't the right time, she said. The right time, he repeated as though testing the words. I needed it when it was actually needed, she said. Not before. Using it before would have looked like retaliation. Using it now, in response to a legal threat, means something different. He was quiet for a moment. You thought all of that through. 7 months ago. I thought it through the night Edmund made his speech about loyalty, she said. He looked at her. Do you know how he stopped? Started differently. I have met a great many people in my life who claim to be principled. Who used the word like a medal they were showing you. You do not use it at all, you simply are it, and it is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen. Clara looked at him. The corridor was quiet around them. Someone moved in the room at the end of the hall. Outside, a cart went past on the road. She felt the weight of everything between them, every word and every silence and every moment of carrying something that the other person couldn't see. Everything they had both been too careful and too hurt and too proud to say. All of it, sitting in the air between them, asking to be acknowledged. Nathaniel, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He heard it the way she had heard her own, like something dropped. I am not ready to trust you fully, she said. I want to be honest about that. What you did, what you chose, I understand it better than I did. I understand the cost it would have meant, and I understand that you were afraid. But understanding something is not the same as having finished with it. There is still a part of me that is not finished. He nodded, once waiting, but she said, and she let that sit for a moment. I have watched you, these past months. I have watched you when you didn't know I was watching, and when you did. And what I see is not a man performing change for an audience. What I see is a man who is genuinely, uncomfortably, unglamorously trying to become something better than what he was. And I think she stopped, breathed. I think that deserves to be acknowledged. He was completely still. I am not saying what comes next, she said. I don't know what comes next. I am only saying that I see what you are doing. And I see that it is real. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. Something large and raw and carefully held. That is more than I expected, he said. I know, she said. Don't make it into more than I've said. I won't, he said immediately. Good, she picked up her notebook. Now the supply records in the south storage room are still not properly categorized and the administrator is expecting my report before Friday, so I am going back to work. He stepped aside. She walked past him down the corridor. She did not look back, but she was aware with every step, all the way back to the storage room, and the disordered supply records and the ordinary solid, real work waiting for her of the feeling in her chest. Not the grief, not the anger, not even the stubborn, quiet love she had been carrying for months. Something new, something that felt cautiously like the beginning of a door opening. She wasn't through it yet. She was not going to rush through it. She had learned too much and built too much to sacrifice any of it to impatience. But the door was there, and for the first time in a very long time she did not feel the need to look away from it. The door, as it turned out, did not open quickly. Clara had not expected it to. She had learned enough about herself in the past 7 months to know that she did not do anything quickly when it mattered, not her decisions, not her trust, not the careful, deliberate process of allowing someone back into a space they had damaged. She moved at the speed of honesty, which was sometimes frustratingly slow and was always, in the end, the only speed that worked. March arrived, then April. The work at St. Andrew's continued. The Tuesdays and Thursdays continued. The conversations continued longer now, less carefully bounded, spilling occasionally, past the edges of work, into something that was simply two people who found each other interesting, talking. She noticed that he listened to her, the same way he always had, that particular stillness, that complete attention, and she noticed that she had stopped bracing herself against it the way she had in the first months, when every good quality she observed in him felt like a complication she didn't need. The complications she had accepted were not going away. They were simply changing shape. William Caldwell came to the hospital on a Thursday in late March and found Claire there reorganizing the Eastern storage records. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that was caught, briefly, between surprise and something warmer. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, without looking up from the shelf. "The supply ledger is on the second shelf, if you are looking for it." A pause. "How did you know that's what I was looking for?" "Because it's the third Thursday you've come, and on the first 2 Thursdays you spent 10 minutes looking for the supply ledger before someone helped you find it." She heard him make a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Nathaniel didn't tell me you'd be here today," he said, coming into the room. "Nathaniel doesn't always know my schedule," she said. No. William picked up the supply ledger from the second shelf exactly where she had said it was. "I imagine you don't share it automatically." "I imagine you're right," she said pleasantly. He stood there for a moment, holding the ledger, in the way that indicated he had something else he wanted to say and was working out how. "He talks about you," William said finally. "My brother." Not the way he used to talk about people, not strategically. "He just mentions you. The way you mention something that is part of your daily thinking." Clara looked at her shelf. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully. "William," he said. "We talked in the correspondence room for 2 years. I think we're past Mr. Caldwell." She allowed that. "William, I appreciate what you are trying to do, but I need you to understand that whatever is or isn't happening between your brother and me will happen at exactly the pace I decide it happens. Not faster because someone I like and respect is nudging it." William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'd say something like that." "Did he?" He also said not to push. "That you'd," I'm quoting him here, "do what she does at her own pace, and any interference will only demonstrate why she was right not to trust me in the first place." Clara set down her notebook. She turned and looked at William Caldwell properly for the first time since he'd come in. He was watching her with the same dark eyes as his brother, the same quality of directness, but warmer, less armored, as though he'd never developed the particular defenses that Nathaniel's position had required. "He said that," she said. "Word for word," William said. "I have a good memory." She picked her notebook back up. "Then perhaps," she said, "he is paying attention." "He is," William said quietly. "He really truly is." He found the supply ledger entry he needed and left without pushing further. Clara went back to her records and did not examine too carefully the feeling that was sitting in her chest like a warm stone. April moved into May. The Virginia heat began its slow return, like something that had been away on business and was coming back certain of its welcome. Clara's work at Waverly & Sons had expanded to the point where George had formalized the partnership in writing a small, undramatic ceremony in the back office that consisted primarily of George handing her a document, watching her sign it, and then saying, "Good, that's done," and returning to his correspondence. Patience had made small cakes to celebrate. which they ate with the same comfortable, slightly ridiculous solemnity of people marking a real occasion with inadequate pomp. Clara had her name on a business, her name on a document, on a business that was real and operating and growing. She thought about the girl who had kept her family's accounts at 15, watching the numbers with a fear that if she looked away, they would worsen. She thought about the woman who had walked away from Caldwell Estate with $4 and no references, and the absolute bone-deep certainty that she would rather be poor and honest than comfortable and silent. She thought, look where honesty gets you. She was sitting with this thought at her desk, with the late afternoon coming through the window and Patience, humming something French in the outer office, when a knock at the front door produced not a client, but Margaret Caldwell. Clara heard Patience's voice change register in the outer office. Heard the particular formal note that meant the visitor was someone significant. She set down her pen. She heard Patience say, carefully, let me see if she is available. Patience appeared in the doorway of the back office. Her eyes were large. She said in a voice pitched just below Margaret Caldwell's probable hearing range, it is Mrs. Caldwell, the elder Mrs. Caldwell. She says she would like a word with you. Privately, Clara looked at Patience. Patience looked back with the expression of someone very committed to not influencing the decision, but very desperate to know what it would be. Show her in, Clara said. Patience withdrew. A moment later, Margaret Caldwell entered the back office of Waverley and Sons with the bearing of a woman who had never in her life entered a room that was not prepared to receive her, and managed, through sheer force of comportment, to make this room feel like it had been. She looked at Clara. Clara looked at her. Mrs. Caldwell, Clara said. Please sit down. I prefer to stand, Margaret said. I won't take much of your time. All right, Clara said, and remained seated. Calmly, at her own desk, something moved very slightly in Margaret Caldwell's expression, not offense, but recognition. The recognition of a woman encountering another woman, who is not going to stand up to make her feel important, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that this particular woman never was going to. I came, Margaret said, because I owe you a debt that I do not particularly enjoy owing. Clara said nothing. She waited. You were right, Margaret said. Each word was distinct and separate and clearly cost something. About Edmund Fairfax, about the accounts, about all of it. A pause. I knew you were right before Nathaniel found the veteran's letters. I had been told, independently, by a woman whose husband had written to the fund, and I chose to believe Edmund's explanation. Clara felt something shift. She had not expected this. She had not constructed any version of this moment in her mind because she had not considered it a possibility. Margaret Caldwell, standing in her office, saying, I knew. You knew, Clara said. I suspected, Margaret said precisely. There is a difference, but yes, I suspected, and I chose the comfortable version of events. The same choice your son made. Margaret's chin went up. For a moment something fierce crossed her face, then it settled. Yes, she said, the same choice. A pause that seemed to take effort. I did not make it easy for you to stay. I made it. I made the situation considerably worse when you came to me privately, before you went to Nathaniel. Clara stared at her. You came to me, Margaret said, reading the look correctly. In February, before you went to Nathaniel with the full documentation. You told me you had concerns about the accounts and asked for my guidance. February, 8 months before the dining hall. Clara had been careful and methodical. She had gone first to the woman she thought might have the most invested in protecting the fund's integrity, the matriarch, the family moral center, the person who had organized the charitable dinners and written the letters and cared, visibly, publicly, about the family's reputation for generosity. She had gone to Margaret Caldwell and said, carefully, that she had found some things she did not understand and wanted guidance. And Margaret Caldwell had told her, with great warmth and finality, that Edmund Fairfax had managed the estate accounts for 11 years, and that Clara was new and likely unfamiliar with how such things were managed, and that she should focus on her own responsibilities. Clara had not told Nathaniel about that conversation. She had gone back to her records and looked again, and been more certain than ever. and then she had gone to Nathaniel 3 weeks later with the full documentation. She had never, in all the months since, mentioned the earlier conversation with Margaret. "You remember," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "I remember," Clara said. "Yes." "And then, when you went to Nathaniel and he dismissed you as well, and the whole family asked you to apologize." Margaret stopped. Her composure was entirely intact, but something underneath it was not. "You said nothing about our conversation. You could have. You could have told Nathaniel that you had come to me first. It would have changed the picture considerably." "Yes," Clara said, "it would have. Why didn't you?" Clara looked at her steadily. "Because I wasn't trying to destroy your family, Mrs. Caldwell. I was trying to protect the fund. Using that conversation to protect myself would have caused damage I wasn't willing to cause." Margaret Caldwell stood very still. For a moment, just a moment, the composure shifted. Not much. Just enough to see underneath it a 61-year-old woman who was reckoning with something that was genuinely difficult to reckon with. "You protected me," Margaret said, quietly, "when I had given you no reason to." "I did what I thought was right," Clara said. "That is all." Another silence. Margaret reached into her reticule and produced a small envelope, which she placed on the edge of Clara's desk. "That is not money," she said immediately, reading Clara's expression. "I am not foolish enough to offer you money. It is a letter of introduction to every woman of standing in Richmond that I have any influence with." A pause. "Your partnership with Mr. Waverley is a beginning. A letter from me will open certain doors that would otherwise remain closed to a woman operating independently. I thought it is the least I can do. It is considerably less than you are owed. But it is what I have." Clara looked at the envelope. She thought about the pavement in September, Margaret's carrying voice. Miss Whitmore, the two-word sentence that had placed her in a category and dismissed her from it in the same breath. She thought about what it meant that this woman was standing in her office now. "Thank you," Clara said. She picked up the envelope. "I accept it." Something released in Margaret's posture. "Just slightly. My son," Margaret began, and then stopped. "Mrs. Caldwell," Clara said, not unkindly, "I think we have both said what needed saying today. The rest of it is between your son and me." Margaret looked at her. One more long, assessing look, and then she nodded, a real nod, not the social hierarchy nod of the pavements in September, but something more level. "Good day, Miss Whitmore," she said. "Good day, Mrs. Caldwell." She left. Patience materialized in the doorway approximately 3 seconds later. "What was that?" she said. Not a question, a statement of awe. "A reckoning," Clara said. She set the envelope carefully in her desk drawer. "Put the kettle on, Patience. I need tea." She sat with the knowledge of Margaret's visit for a long time that evening, the second secret, the earlier conversation, the choice Clara had made to stay silent about it. She had not thought about it often in the intervening months. She had done it and put it away the way she put most things away. But hearing it named, Margaret say, "You protected me," brought it back with a weight she hadn't anticipated. She had protected the woman who had dismissed her. She had walked out of the dining hall and absorbed the consequences of being publicly wrong in that family's eyes, and had never once deployed her strongest piece of protection, because using it would have caused damage she didn't want to cause. Was that strength? Thought so. She hoped so. It was also, she thought, sitting at her father's desk in the late May evening, the proof of what she had always known about herself and had been forced, by months of difficulty, to confirm. She was not interested in winning. She was interested in what was right. Those were not the same thing, and she had never, in all of it, confused them. She picked up her pen. She opened her journal. She wrote, "Margaret Caldwell came today." She knew. She knew before Nathaniel knew, and she made the same choice. "And she came and told me, which I had not expected and which I think cost her more than anything she has done in some time. I think that deserves to be seen." She paused, then wrote, "I think I am almost finished being angry." She put down the pen. She sat with that sentence, almost. Not entirely, almost. The letter of introduction opened 3 doors within the first month. a firm of solicitors on the north side of Richmond who needed regular account management. A merchants' association that had been attempting to organize its collective records for 2 years without success. A small charitable society that needed someone to overhaul their books and train a member to maintain them. Clara took all three. She negotiated every rate herself. She walked into every room as a partner of Waverley and Sons, with Margaret Caldwell's letter in her history and her own work as her evidence, and she did not apologize for any of it. It was in the middle of June high summer, the heat back in full force, that Nathaniel appeared at Waverley and Sons one afternoon unannounced and found Clara in conversation with 2 men from the Merchants' Association. He waited outside, which she discovered when she came out, and nearly walked into him on the pavement. "I didn't know you had a meeting," he said. "I didn't know you were coming," she said. They looked at each other. A comfortable, familiar look, not the careful weight-bearing look of the earlier months, but something that had worn smooth with use. "Walk with me," he said, "when you're done if you want to." She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to retrieve her coat. "All right," she said. They walked. The Richmond streets in June were full of the ordinary summer business of a working city, and they moved through it with the ease of people who had spent enough time alongside each other to be comfortable in silence. He told her about the estate. He had formalized new agreements with the tenant farmers, better terms, a fairer system of payment, a process for addressing grievances that hadn't existed before. He had hired a new estate manager, a man named Prescott, younger than Edmund, recommended by 2 families he trusted, and was overseeing the transition personally, rather than handing it off. "It is more work than I expected," he said without complaint. "But I think it is the right kind of work." "It is," she said. "Your mother's letter," he said then, which startled her. The Merchants' Association. Mrs. Hardcastle mentioned to William that they had engaged Waverley and Sons on my mother's recommendation. He glanced at her. "My mother went to see you." "She did," Clara said. "She didn't tell me." "No, I imagine she wanted to do it without an audience." A pause. "What did she say?" Clara was quiet for a moment, measuring what was hers to share and what was Margaret's. "She said things that needed to be said," she said. "And she listened to things she needed to hear. I think we understood each other better at the end of it than we did at the beginning." He absorbed that. She could see him absorbing it, the careful way he processed things he hadn't anticipated, like a man who had learned to stop and think before he reacted. "She has never in her life apologized to anyone beneath her station," he said finally. "Not in any form I have ever seen, I know," Clara said. "Then you understand what it meant." "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." They walked on. A child ran across the street in front of them, and Nathaniel stepped aside with automatic courtesy, putting himself briefly between the child's path and Clara, and then they were walking again as though it hadn't happened. She had noticed things like that in the months of Tuesdays and Thursdays and occasional unexpected afternoons. The automatic courtesies, not performed, not calculated, but simply the habitual motion of someone in whom consideration had become reflex. She didn't know when it had shifted. Somewhere between November and now, the pride had changed into something that expressed itself differently. Less as the need to be right, more as the need to do right. She didn't say any of this. She kept it in the private journal of her own observation, where she kept most things until she was certain. But she noticed. They stopped at the corner of the market square, the same corner where he had said her name in November, and she had walked away carrying something new in her chest. "Clara," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I have been careful," he said, "not to ask you for things. I understand why, and I am not going to push. But I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it once clearly, without it being a request." She waited. "I love you," he said. His voice was very steady. "I think I have loved you since for a long time. Since before I understood what that actually required. Since before I knew that love without respect is just possession with a prettier name." He paused. "I am not saying it because I expect anything from it. I am saying it because you deserve to know it. Because you have deserved honesty from me from the very beginning, and I was too proud to give it to you then, and I am not willing to be too proud to give it to you now." Clara looked at him. She felt the words land. She let them land, rather than deflecting them the way she had deflected so much in the past year, the careful armor of self-sufficiency that had kept her safe and which she now, standing here in the June heat with the market square busy around them, understood she no longer needed in the same way. She didn't cry, she rarely cried. But something in her that had been held very tightly for a very long time loosened by one more degree. "I know," she said. He nodded. He had promised not to push, and he didn't. He started to turn. "Nathaniel," he stopped. "I said I was almost finished being angry," she said. "A few weeks ago, I wrote it down." She looked at him steadily. "I think I am finished now." He turned back fully. His face was very carefully controlled, but she had learned to read what the control was holding. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means," she said, "that I have built something that is entirely mine. That is not going to change. The partnership, the work. The life I have here, none of that changes. I would never ask it to," he said immediately. "I know," she said. "That is part of why I'm saying this." She took a breath. "It means that I would like to have dinner with you. As two people who are choosing each other's company. Not at the estate, not anything formal, just dinner." He looked at her. That look she had always found honest, direct, steady, completely present. "When?" he said. "Friday," she said. "There is a place on the East Road that George recommends. He says the pie is exceptional." "Friday," Nathaniel said, as though he were checking whether the word was real. "Yes. All right." And then very quietly, "Thank you, Clara." "Don't thank me," she said. "Show up on time." He almost smiled. It was, she thought, one of the finest almost smiles she had ever seen. She walked back toward Waverly and Sons with the June heat pressing warm against her shoulders, and the particular feeling in her chest that was no longer cautious and unnamed, but was settling, gradually, into something she recognized. She had come a very long way from the dining hall. From $4.60. From the woman who had pressed her hands flat against a table and looked into the eyes of the man she loved, and understood she was going to have to choose between truth and comfort. She had chosen truth every single time, at every single cost she had chosen truth. And now she was a partner of a real firm with her name on a document and a letter from Margaret Caldwell in her history, and 3 clients she had won herself and a room that was hers and a life she had built without anyone's permission. She was also a woman who was having dinner on Friday with the man she loved. Not because she needed him, not because he had saved her. Not because the life she had built required him in it. Because she was free to choose, and she was choosing. That was the difference. She understood it completely now, in a way she had only partially understood when she had walked out of Caldwell Estate a year ago. She had known then that she was refusing to be smaller. She had not known yet how large she would become. Now she knew, and from this size, from this solid, earned, unassailable ground, she was reaching toward him. Not falling, not being pulled, reaching, with intention and clarity and the full knowledge of who she was. She went back to her desk. She had work to finish before Friday. She picked up her pen. She got back to work, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, the work felt not like survival but like the sound of her own life, full and ongoing, going exactly where she had built it to go. Friday came the way important things always came, ordinary on the outside, significant underneath. Clara finished her work at 4:30, changed into the blue dress she had bought herself in March with the first month's profit share from the partnership, and walked to the East Road establishment George Waverly had recommended, with the same calm, deliberate step she brought to everything that mattered. She arrived first. She had expected to. She was always early when things were important, because being early meant she had a moment to settle herself before anyone else could read her face. She had barely sat down when Nathaniel came through the door. He was exactly on time. She noticed that. She noticed that he had clearly made an effort. His coat was his better one, his hat was in his hand before he was fully through the door, and she noticed that when he saw her already seated, something in his expression did a thing she recognized now as relief. As though he had been worried, between Wednesday's corner and Friday's arrival, that she might have reconsidered. She hadn't. She was not a woman who reconsidered things she had said with intention. He sat down across from her. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and in that moment was everything: the dining hall, and the market square, and the hospital corridor, and the long ordinary Tuesdays that had become something neither of them had planned on. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. "I know." A pause. "I know you did." The pie, as George had promised, was exceptional. They talked about easy things first, the way people do when they are carrying harder things and are not quite ready to set them down. The estate, the firm, William's recent announcement that he intended to go into law, which Nathaniel reported with an expression of mingled pride and exasperation that made Clara laugh, a real laugh, unguarded. And she watched him watch her laugh, with an expression she didn't try to deflect. "William would be a good lawyer," she said. "He would," Nathaniel agreed. "He is stubborn and he remembers everything people say, and he has a deep personal investment in being right." A pause. "He learned that last part from me. I'm trying not to feel too responsible for it." "You should feel a little responsible," Clara said. "Yes," he said, "I probably should." They were quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that happens between people who have run out of easy things and are standing at the edge of the harder ones. "Can I ask you something?" Nathaniel said. "Yes," that night. The dining hall. He looked at her steadily. "Were you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. "Not of leaving," she said. "I had already decided to leave before I picked up my gloves." "What I was afraid of," she paused. "I was afraid that it would break something in me. That walking out would cost me something I couldn't rebuild." "Did it?" "No," she said. "It turned out I was more than I knew." He absorbed that. "I watched you walk away," he said. "From the upstairs window. I told myself you'd come back." "I know," she said. "I could feel you expecting it." "How?" "Because I knew you," she said simply. "I had spent 8 months watching you, and I knew how you thought. You believed that I would realize, eventually, that my position at the estate was worth more than my position on the matter. That my pride would be overtaken by my practical circumstances." She looked at him. "What you didn't understand was that the practical circumstances and the principle were not separate things to me. My integrity was my most practical asset. Compromising it would have cost me more than losing the position." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that now," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That is a large part of why we are having dinner." He looked at her, that honest, direct look. "What are the other parts?" "The veterans' families," she said. "The hospital. The new tenant agreements. William showing up on Thursdays. Your mother standing in my office." She paused. "And the fact that when you told me you loved me, you didn't ask me for anything afterward." Something moved across his face. "I meant it that way." "I know," she said. "That is the other large part." They walked back through the June evening afterward, side by side, not touching but close, in the way of people who have made a decision and are comfortable in the making of it. At the corner of her street he stopped. "Clara," he said. She stopped. She turned. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "I want to be very clear that I understand the pace is yours. But I need to know, what are we doing? I don't need a timeline. I just need to know that we are, that this is." "Yes," she said. "Yes to which part?" "Yes to all of it," she said. "We are doing something real. It will go at the pace it goes. I am not in a hurry and I will not be rushed, but yes." He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. "All right," he said. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. "Good night, Clara." She walked up her street and did not look back, but she was smiling, and the evening was warm, and she thought, yes. The something real, as it turned out, looked very much like ordinary life, which was the best thing it could look like, and exactly what she had needed it to be. He came to Waverly & Sons on a Saturday in July, not on business, not with an agenda, just carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner that George had recently declared made the best coffee in Richmond, and set one on her desk with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who had decided that caring for someone could simply look like knowing how they took their coffee. She took the cup. She kept working. He sat in the client chair across from her desk and read the newspaper and didn't require anything from her, except the occasional comment when he found something worth discussing, and she offered comments when she had them. And it was so entirely without performance or pressure that it took her 20 minutes to realize she was more comfortable than she had been in years. "You're doing it deliberately," she said, not looking up from her figures. "Doing what?" "Being undemanding. A pause. Is it working?" "It's deeply irritating," she said, "because yes." She heard him set down the newspaper. "Clara, I spent 35 years being a man who entered rooms and expected them to rearrange themselves around me. I think I can spend some time being someone who just exists in a room, without requiring anything from it." She looked up then. He was looking at her with the steady, unhurried expression of a man who had genuinely made peace with something that had previously cost him a great deal. "Who told you that's what I needed?" she said. "No one," he said. "I watched you for months. You don't need to be impressed. You don't need to be won. You need to be seen, without agenda, without anyone wanting something from the seeing." She looked at him for a long moment. "You have been paying attention," she said. "I told you I would," he said. He picked up the newspaper again. "Now stop testing me and finish your figures." She almost smiled. She went back to her figures. Patience, who had been in the outer office during this entire exchange and had heard every word through the thin partition wall, said nothing when Clara came out at the end of the afternoon. She simply looked at Clara with an expression of profound satisfaction and handed her the outgoing correspondence. "Not a word," Clara said. "I wasn't going to say a word," Patience said. "You were going to say several words. I was going to say that the coffee on your desk looked very good, and that you seemed very settled this afternoon," Patience said carefully. "That is several words," Clara said. "Every one of them true," Patience said, and went back to her filing with a serene expression that Clara elected to ignore. August came, a full year since Clara had walked out of Caldwell Estate. She marked the anniversary alone in the morning, sitting at her father's writing desk with a cup of tea. Not with grief, not with bitterness, with something that was quieter and more durable than either, a kind of steady private acknowledgement. She had walked out with $4 and her integrity, and she had built in 1 year more than she had expected to build in 5. She wrote in her journal, "A year ago today I chose the truth. I am still choosing it. I think I always will. It is the only thing I know how to do." She closed the journal. She drank her tea. She went to work. That afternoon, Reverend Howell came by Waverly and Sons on his pastoral rounds, and sat with her in the back office for half an hour, with the comfortable ease of a man who has watched someone come through fire, and is very quietly glad about it. "You are well," he said. It was not a question. "I am very well," she said. "I hear Mr. Caldwell has been a regular presence," the Reverend said, in the tone of a man reporting a pastoral observation. "He has," Clara said. "And you are comfortable with that?" "I am choosing that," she said. "There's a difference." The Reverend smiled. "Yes," he said, "there is exactly that difference." He turned his teacup in his hands, in the gesture she had come to associate with him, about to say something significant. "You know, when I wrote that recommendation for you, that letter to the Caldwells, I was not entirely certain I was doing right by you." She looked at him. "Why? Because I knew the household," he said. "I knew the family, and I thought she is too honest for that place. She will not last 6 months without walking into something." He paused. "I was not wrong about the walking into something." "No," Clara said, "you were not, but I was wrong about what it would mean." He looked at her with the warm, measured look of a man who has spent a lifetime watching people and has not stopped being moved by them. "You did not just survive it, Clara. You became something because of it. And I am not sure you would have become it any other way." She sat with that for a moment. "I think that's true," she said. "I think I needed to find out that I could stand on nothing and still stand. I didn't know that about myself before, and now?" "Now I know," she said simply. He left shortly after. She sat at her desk in the August afternoon and thought about what he'd said. She will not last 6 months without walking into something, and thought about the particular kind of walking into something that had been her entire life since November of 1813. The constant, deliberate, unswerving willingness to walk directly into the thing that was difficult and true, rather than around it, toward the thing that was easy and comfortable. It had cost her a great deal. It had also made her entirely herself. She was deep in this thought when the door opened and Patience said, in the particular voice she used for arrivals, that required Clara's personal attention, "Miss Whitmore." "You have a visitor," Clara expected Nathaniel. It was a Tuesday. It was not Nathaniel. It was a woman she had never seen before, perhaps 40 years old, wearing plain, careful clothing with the particular neatness of someone who has very little and keeps what they have in excellent order. She had a worn traveling bag over her arm, and the look of someone who has made a significant journey and arrived at the end of it uncertain whether it was worth making. She stopped inside the door of the back office and looked at Clara. "Are you Miss Whitmore?" she said. "Miss Clara Whitmore, who was employed at Caldwell Estate." "I am," Clara said carefully. "I am Mrs. Eliza Sutter," the woman said. "My husband was Thomas Sutter. He served in the war. He died at the Siege of York in 1813. Clara was on her feet before she was aware of standing. "Mrs. Sutter," she said. "Please sit down." Eliza Sutter sat. She held her bag on her lap with both hands, the grip of a woman holding something tightly because letting go feels dangerous. "Mr. Caldwell came to see me," she said, "in September of last year. He told me about the fund and what had happened to it, and he compensated us. He compensated all of us." She paused. "He also told me about you. He told me that you were the one who found it. He said he wanted me to know who had actually done it, because he felt it was important that I did." Clara absorbed this. Nathaniel had told her. Nathaniel had gone to the veterans' families and explained not just that the money was being returned, but where the discovery had come from. He had given her name when he didn't have to, when giving her name served no purpose for him and made the story of his own failure more complete. He had done that and never told her. She felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully. The way ice cracks in a thaw, the sound of something that has been frozen for a long time beginning finally to move. "What he did not tell me," Eliza Sutter continued, "was how to find you. I had to. I asked around. It took me some time." She looked at Clara steadily. The look of a woman who has decided to say something and is going to say it. "I came because I needed to thank you, in person. Not for the money, though God knows the money has kept my children fed and my children in school, and I will be grateful for it every day of my life." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I came because you were a woman alone with nothing behind you, and you found out what was happening, and you refused to be quiet about it, even when it cost you everything. And I needed you to know that someone saw that, someone who it mattered to, directly and personally, saw what you did and is not going to forget it." Clara stood very still. She thought about March of last year. The March before that long, difficult, transformative year. The figures in the ledger, precise and damning. The stone of knowledge sitting in her chest that she had not been able to put down regardless of what it cost to carry. She had carried it for no one. She had carried it because it was true, and she could not be someone who looked at truth and turned away. She had not carried it for Eliza Sutter, or for Thomas Sutter's children, or for the acknowledgement of anyone. She had carried it because it was right, and yet, "Thank you for coming," Clara said. Her voice was steady but required some effort to keep that way. "I am very glad to meet you, and you," Eliza said. She stood. She held out her hand, not the social gesture but the direct, plain handshake of one working woman to another. Clara took it. They shook hands. Eliza Sutter left. Clara sat back down at her desk. She pressed her hands flat against the wood, the same gesture she realized that she had made in the dining hall, the last conscious thing she had done before picking up her gloves. She pressed her hands flat against the desk and breathed. Patience appeared in the doorway, took one look at Clara's face, withdrew without a word, returned 3 minutes later with a cup of tea, set it on the desk and withdrew again. Clara sat with the tea and the afternoon, and the full weight of everything that year had been, and she let herself feel it, all of it. The grief and the anger and the difficulty and the building and the breaking open and the rebuilding, all the way through. She felt it completely. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Nathaniel arrived at 5:30 as he usually did on Tuesdays. He stopped in the doorway of the back office and looked at her face and said, immediately, "What happened?" Eliza Sutter came to see me, Clara said. Something moved across his face. Guilt and something else, the expression of a man who has done a thing and is now discovering it, has had an effect he hadn't fully predicted. You told her my name, Clara said. Yes, he said. You told all of them. Yes. Why didn't you tell me you had? He came into the office. He sat down in the client chair. He looked at her directly, the way she had come to rely on, the way she had always found honest. Because I wasn't doing it for you to know about, he said. I was doing it because it was right. You deserve to have the truth told correctly, the full truth, including who had actually done the work. Those women deserve to know it was a woman who found it, not just the estate correcting its own mistake. He paused. If I had told you I was telling them, it would have become something I was doing for credit. I didn't want credit, I just wanted it to be true. Clara looked at him for a long time. The summer light was coming through the window, and he was sitting in the client chair of the back office of Waverly & Sons, and he was looking at her with the steady, unhurried, honest look she had loved for 2 years and spent 1 year building herself back up enough to deserve to accept. Nathaniel, she said. Yes, I love you, she said. It came out simply, not the way she had practiced saying things, careful, measured, precisely calibrated. Just simple, like a fact she was finally done keeping private. He didn't say anything for a moment, he just looked at her. Then he said very quietly, Say it again, I love you, she said. I have loved you since before I understood what was required for that to mean something real. And now I understand, and I am still saying it. He was across the room, and on his feet in a movement she hadn't tracked, standing at the edge of her desk, and she stood too, because she was Clara Whitmore, and she did not receive important things sitting down. They were standing very close, closer than they had stood in the hospital corridor, closer than the corner of the market square, closer than any of the careful Tuesdays and ordinary Thursdays. Clara, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Yes, she said. Can I? Yes, she said. He put his hand against her face, one hand, careful and deliberate, and she let him, and she put her hand over his and felt the solid warmth of it and thought, this is what it was all for, not the resolution of suffering, not the reward at the end of difficulty, but this specific thing, two people who had been honest with each other at cost, and were still standing, choosing this. Eyes open, nothing owed, everything chosen. He pressed his forehead against hers. I am going to spend a very long time, he said quietly, becoming worthy of this. You already are, she said. That is why we are here. He pulled back just far enough to look at her. I want to marry you, he said. I am not asking yet. I understand that is a conversation we will have when you are ready and not before. But I want you to know that is what I want. That is the direction I am walking. I know, she said. You knew? I have been watching you for 2 years, she said. I know how you walk toward things. Something broke open in his expression, something enormous and warm that she had been watching build for months, and was glad finally to see arrive. Then you know I'm not stopping, he said. Good, she said. Don't. The town of Richmond did not know what to make of it at first. The word spread, the way words always spread, through the connective tissue of a community that paid attention to its own business and everyone else's. Miss Whitmore of Waverly & Sons, the woman who had made accusations against the Caldwell estate manager and been dismissed, who had come back and built a real business on her own, who had been confirmed correct in every particular, was being seen regularly in the company of Nathaniel Caldwell himself. Some people found this scandalous. Some found it romantic. Some found it a straightforward demonstration of what happened when a woman of genuine ability refused to be managed. Mrs. Vickers, who had stopped Clara on the pavement to offer elaborate false sympathy about the unfortunate situation at the Caldwell estate, saw them together at church in September and said something quietly to the woman beside her. Clara felt it without turning around. She didn't turn around. She had spent enough of her life managing other people's opinions. She was done with it. The opinions could arrange themselves however they liked. She knew what was true. She knew what she had built. She knew who was standing beside her and why. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was patience who forced the next development, in her particular way that involved no force at all, and was therefore impossible to resist. She came into the back office on a Wednesday morning in October and placed a document on Clara's desk. Clara looked at it. It was a formal proposal written in Patience's neat, careful hand for expanding Waverly & Sons to include a department handling charitable organization accounts, with a client list that included the Soldiers' Relief Fund at St. Andrews, the charitable society that had hired Clara in May, and 3 other organizations in the Richmond area that Patience had apparently researched and identified as needing exactly the service they could provide. Clara read it carefully. She read it a second time. "When did you write this?" she said. "Over the past month," Patience said, standing very straight in the way she stood when she was trying to appear more certain than she felt. "I know it is not my place to propose business strategy. But I thought you have all the connections, and I have the time, and the organizational capacity, and I thought it seemed wrong not to say something." Clara set the document down. "This is excellent," she said. Patience blinked. It is thoroughly researched, clearly written, and identifies a genuine gap in the market that we are uniquely positioned to fill." Clara looked at her. "Did you run these numbers yourself?" "Yes," Patience said. "They are correct. I know," Patience said, and then looked slightly startled at herself. Clara almost smiled. "You have been paying attention," she said. "You are a very instructive person to work for," Patience said carefully. Clara stood up. She picked up the proposal. "We are going to take this to George," she said. "And you are going to present it." Patience's eyes went wide. "Me? You wrote it," Clara said. "You understand it better than I do." "You present it, but he's Mr. Waverly. He is George," Clara said. "And he is going to say exactly what he always says, which is, 'That's better. Why didn't Harold do that?' And then he is going to tell you to proceed." She was already at the door of the back office. "Come on," George said almost exactly that. He read the proposal, turned it over, read the numbers again, and said, "That's sound." "Why didn't I think of that?" "Because Harold didn't propose it and then move to Georgia," Clara said. George gave her a look that contained a great deal of suppressed amusement. "All right," he said to Patience. "Build the client list. Bring me a timeline by end of month." Patience walked out of George's office looking like a person who has just discovered something significant about herself. Clara knew that look. She recognized it precisely. She had worn it herself, in a different office, on a different morning, at the beginning of a different year. "Patience," she said. Patience turned. Her expression was still slightly stunned. "You are not going to stay at a desk forever," Clara said. "I want you to know that, whatever you build here, it is yours. I will make sure of it." Patience looked at her for a moment. And then in her direct and guileless way, "You know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" "I think about you walking out of that estate with nothing," she said. "And I think if she could do that, then I can do anything I set my mind to." She paused. "You are the most frightening and inspiring person I have ever met." "Frightening," Clara said. "In the best way," Patience said firmly. Clara shook her head. She went back to her office. She sat down at her desk. She thought about Patience's words. About what it meant to be someone else's evidence that something was possible. She had never thought of herself that way, had never thought about being watched the way she watched others, as a proof of something. She thought, this is also what the truth costs, not just suffering, but this, being the proof that it was possible to survive it. She picked up her pen. She wrote one sentence in her journal, there at the desk in the October afternoon, and then closed it and got back to work. The sentence was, "It was worth it, all of it, every part." It was worth it. The dinner where Nathaniel proposed was not dramatic. It was a Saturday evening in November, exactly 1 year and 3 months after Clara had walked out of Caldwell Estate. They were at the same East Road establishment, the same table, the same exceptional pie, and Nathaniel reached into his coat and placed a small object on the table between them. It was a ring. Simple gold, with a single small stone, not the elaborate piece a man of his means might have chosen if he were making a point about his means. The exact right ring for Clara Whitmore, who was not impressed by points about means. He didn't get down on one knee. She would have been uncomfortable with that, and he knew it. He just put the ring on the table and looked at her and said, "You said you would know when you were ready. Are you ready?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about everything, the beginning, the middle, the long, difficult passage through the year that had made her who she was. She thought about what she was saying yes to and what she was not saying yes to. She was not saying yes to being protected. She was not saying yes to being managed or contained or made smaller for anyone's comfort. She was not saying yes to giving up the partnership or the work or the life she had built. She was saying yes to the man across the table who knew all of that and was asking anyway. Who had watched her build and been proud of her for it. Who had told the veterans' families her name because she deserved the truth to be told correctly. Who had learned slowly, genuinely, at real cost to his pride, that love without respect was only possession. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger. He looked at her hand. Then at her face. "Thank you," he said very quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "I told you that before." "I know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." "Then let me say something too," she said. He waited. "I did not choose you because I needed you," she said. "I chose you because you became someone worth choosing. There is a very large difference. I need you to carry that." "I will," he said, "every day." She believed him. She believed him because she had spent 2 years watching what he did when no one was testing him, when there was no audience, when the only reason to do the right thing was that it was right. She had watched him carry supply crates in his shirt sleeves and visit soldiers' widows and give her name when he didn't have to, and say nothing about any of it. She had watched him become, through effort that was private and sustained and real, the person she had always thought he was capable of being. That was not hope. That was not the romantic instinct to see the best version of someone and insist on its existence. That was evidence. Clara Whitmore had always trusted evidence. In the spring of 1816 they married. Not the elaborate ceremony a Caldwell wedding might have been. A quiet church service with Reverend Howell presiding, George Waverley in the front pew looking gruff and pleased in equal measure, Patience crying happily and making no attempt to hide it. William Caldwell standing up for his brother with the expression of a man who has been proven correct about something and is enjoying it enormously, and Margaret Caldwell in the second row wearing an expression that had worked its way. By some internal architecture Clara respected, from judgment into something approaching genuine warmth. After the service, when the small gathering had moved outside into the April morning, Margaret came and stood before Clara. She looked at her for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," she said, "when Nathaniel first hired you." "No," Clara said, "I imagine not. You are considerably more," Margaret said. And then, with the particular difficulty of a woman who has not said this kind of thing often, "I am glad. I am glad he found you, and I am glad you were stubborn enough to be exactly what you are." Clara looked at her. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. It was the first time she had used the name. Margaret absorbed it with a small, precise nod that contained an entire negotiated treaty. On their first morning at the Caldwell estate, Clara's first morning back in the house, she had left with $4, and her integrity, she came downstairs to find Nathaniel already at the desk in the study, going through papers. He looked up when she came in. "You're working," she said. "Tenant agreement renewal," he said. "Prescott needs my decision by Thursday." "I'll look at it with you," she said. She pulled up the chair across from him. "Move over." He moved the papers toward her without question. She picked up the nearest document and started reading. They worked in silence for a while, the same comfortable, productive silence of two people who had discovered they could exist in a room together without either of them needing to rearrange for the other. After some time, Nathaniel said, without looking up, "You know, a year ago I would have said this was not how a man spent the morning after his wedding. And now?" He looked up. He looked at her, at the woman sitting across his desk, reading his papers, already finding something in them that needed a question, already thinking 3 steps ahead. The woman who had walked out of this house with $4 and built herself into someone who came back entirely on her own terms. "Now," he said quietly, "I think this is exactly how a man spends the morning after his wedding." if he is lucky enough to marry the right woman. Clara looked up from the document. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the desk and placed the paper in front of him and said, "This clause about the harvest share is going to cause problems in September. You need to revise it before Thursday." He looked at the clause. He looked at her. He picked up his pen. "You're right," he said. She had been right from the beginning, right about Edmund Fairfax, right about the fund, right about what love required, right about what she was worth. She had paid for being right with everything she had, and she had rebuilt from nothing, and she had returned not because she had been rescued, but because she had become, through her own will and her own honesty and her own refusal to be silent, a woman who could choose freely and had chosen this. Not the estate, not the name, not the safety of a powerful man's protection. The man himself, revised, reckoned with, genuinely changed. Sitting across a desk from her on an April morning, writing a corrected clause in the house that was now as much hers as his. That was the truth of it. That was the whole truth, plain and entire. And Clara Whitmore, who had always at every cost chosen the truth, would not have had it any other way.